other button. There we go. Good afternoon. We have some of our parliamentarians with us, and hopefully they'll watch the live feed afterwards to see what those of you who aren't in the room, you'll see it later. So I want to welcome everybody so warmly to ParlAmericas. It's session here in Victoria, British Columbia, which is just a few hours south of Nanaimo, Ladysmith, where I'm elected. So honored that you are in my backyard. And I want to recognize that we're meeting on Coast Salish territory, First Nations land that has not been ceded, including the site of our parliament here, unceded First Nations Coast Salish land. So we give thanks for us being able to meet and do our work here. My name is Sheila Malcolmson. I'm a member of parliament from Nanaimo, Ladysmith. This is my first term of office, and I'm very lucky, my third time that I've been part of a ParlAmericas session, and very much appreciate the collaboration and solidarity expressed by parliamentarians from North, Central, and South America, and the richness of the conversations and what we teach each other. And when we work together, we all go home to the places that the people elected us with more wealth to impart into our decision making. Now, this ParlAmericas plenary assembly is focused on inclusiveness, which means that views from all sectors of society are considered in our decision making and policy making. And this is important to all aspects of governments, and especially at the core of ParlAmericas' mandate and focus at this time. And it is, for me, central to my responsibility as an elected parliamentarian. Before I was elected to the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa, I served for 12 years, 4 terms in local government, and I learned very well how important it was for our policies and our budgeting to be aligned with the priorities of the people that we serve. And if I didn't get it right, I heard that from them in the grocery aisle. So the proximity of governance, very close. Central to that elected responsibility, though, is to bring the voices into our decision-making of those not at the table, either not in our legislatures or not at our public meetings. So that could be marginalized people who are not able to come. That could be future generations. That could be endangered species or ecosystems that are part of our responsibility but will never literally have a voice at the table. And leaving out those voices can compound the systemic barriers that perpetuate that marginalization. For example, this year in Canada, our all-parliamentary committee on the status of women, and I recognize my fellow member of parliament, Stephanie Kuzi, and I think Mark Saray is here also, not at the table at this time, though. Stephanie and myself are 2 of the 10 members that sit on the Status of Women Committee. There's lots of friends around the table. It's good to see you. This year, we've conducted a study on the economic justice for women in Canada. What are the barriers that leave women further behind in our economy? And we heard a lot of witnesses talk about the failure to legislate pay equity, setting women on a course that left them further behind their whole lives. And as well, the lack of affordable childcare, again, a second level of discrimination. And so this is the cycle that was described. If you and your spouse you cannot find affordable childcare, one of you is going to have to drop out of income earning. Those, the one of you that earns less, which is almost always the woman, that's who leaves the workplace, stays home to look after the children. When those women return to work, once the children are in public school, they are more likely to be in part-time, precarious work. That makes them less likely to be eligible for unemployment insurance, less likely to be in a job where they have benefits or a pension. And so these policy failures that led them to make certain workplace and economic choices early in their life are what are resulting in many of our countries, women who retire in poverty, women who've worked all their lives, never do catch up. And then we think about our budget meetings, that may well be the problem as well. A woman who's working 3 jobs, less likely to find time to come to your budget consultation, and And if you do not have childcare available at your meetings, again, you may well not have the members of your society that you most need to have in mind when you are making your decisions about budget and policy. And so the budgeting process in that context becomes especially important for us as parliamentarians. The people that come and speak to us at microphones at our meetings are not necessarily the people that we most need to serve through our budgeting process. So budgeting directly impacts citizens by allocating resources to government services. It has the potential to remove those barriers to full participation in democracy and in our economy. And to ensure that that budgeting process is inclusive, it has to be transparent, and citizens must be able to all broadly and fully participate. Then creating those opportunities for participation can allow us as parliamentarians to have a thorough understanding of the needs of the people that we serve, to prioritize those resource allocations efficiently and effectively, and really truly meeting the needs of all parliamentarians. And then the Parliament can both oversee that consultation process or full inclusive budgeting process, and then also oversee the implementation of it. And so it's in that context that we have this session today. And to guide us through our session today, I'm so glad that we have as our facilitator, Dr. Helena Gaspard. We have just had a really interesting brief conversation about some of the challenging work that her organization, the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy in Ottawa, of which she is the Director of Governance and Institutions, the work that they're doing with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to properly allocate, in accordance with our constitutional responsibilities, the resources that First Nations children need for education and for health, a long-standing problem that her organization with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal is working very hard to remove the policy barriers to success and justice in that field. And so with thanks to ParlAmericas for inviting me to open our session up, and with a great thanks in advance to the panel that's going to take us through this conversation, I turn it over to Dr. Gaspard.
Thank you very much, Sheila, for the kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Sheila mentioned, our institute at the University of Ottawa works in politics and money. And so I'm not an economist, I am not a financial analyst, but I am a political scientist that uses money to help to solve public policy problems. And so often, when we work with parliamentarians here in Canada and around the world, money becomes the most common denominator, right, that we can use to help understand differences, to help understand similarities, but also to help make change. And it's been great to see how ParlAmericas has put together today's conversation. Because what we're here to do is really three things today. We're here to talk about, right, the foundations of parliaments, right? The foundation of parliament is how do we raise and spend money. The second reason we're here is to talk about the role of parliamentarians, as individual representatives, and ensuring that that's done effectively and responsibly. And finally, we're here to talk about the public, or civil society's role when it comes to public budgeting, when it comes to considerations of money. And these are sometimes difficult pieces to put together. You have a lot to do. You represent a lot of people, and you're managing a lot of disparate interests. And so one of the things that I'm looking forward to today is learning from you, learning from your experiences, and hopefully encouraging a bit of an exchange among us all. So as a bit of an overview, of what we'll be doing today. We'll go around the table, we'll find out who's in the room, who we're going to hear from. Then we'll also get into the budget cycle very briefly, right? What does this look like generally across all of our countries? What are some of the points of intersection? What are some of the places or the moments in the cycle where there's opportunity for involvement, where there may be opportunity for consultation? We'll take some time to learn from our peers. You'll hopefully be able to share some of your practices or proposed practices with us. And then finally, we'll close the session with a distinguished panel. And from my perspective, we get to hear from a variety of parliamentarians, as well as a deputy clerk from the beautiful province of British Columbia, who will take us through sort of the realities on the ground of what it means to combine public participation in budgeting and what it means to actually effectively listen to constituents and to the broader public, which by any stretch is no easy feat. So before we move ahead in our agenda, if I might ask everyone around the table to introduce themselves, your name, the country that you're representing, and perhaps very, very, very briefly, what compelled you to be here today or what brings you to our table. Would you like to begin?
Andy Daniel, I'm the Speaker of the House of Assembly of St. Lucia. I'm also a member of the ParlAmericas Board of Directors. Very well.
Good afternoon, I'm Rina Jaffer and I'm a senator from British Columbia. Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Arthur Holder, Speaker of the House of Assembly from Barbados.
Hi, I'm Bob Nault, the Member of Parliament for Kenora and the Chair of Foreign Affairs Committee and also involved in ParlAmericas as the President. But I'm here because I'm very interested in the role of members of Parliament to strengthen democracy, and if we have a strong representatives of the House and the Senate, then we have a strong democracy if they're involved. So that's why I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, I'm Bridget Anisette George. I am Speaker of the House of Representatives of Trinidad and Tobago and one of the directors of the Board of ParlAmericas. And I'm here because budgets are big parts of what parliaments do. And while we advocate and we represent without money, we can get nothing done. So I think this is very important.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. George Norton. I've been associated with ParlAmericas for probably 2 decades, if that is the length of time it existed. I did, however, as a member of the opposition. Now I'm a minister of the government. And I am very much concerned about budget presentation and preparation, because many times the public expect the government to provide certain services. In reality, they can't. Hence, if efforts should be made before, from the beginning, like we're doing now, where we're preparing the budget for 2019, let the different groups know the limitations we have that will guide their expectation in the upcoming year, particularly in the area that I'm concerned with. I mean culture, youth, and sports. And sports in the Caribbean, for instance, is so important, but yet the sports personalities think that it is the government's duty to provide them with all they need in order to reach their highest standard. Thank you. Guyana.
Good afternoon, I am Nicole Olivier, Member of Parliament of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. I view this session as an important one in sharing ideas and how we can really increase public buy-in when the budget is passed to ensure that you don't get too much negative fallout from what the government would have put forward, and that the public really is on board with the government policies. Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Sharon Samuel, Procedural Clerk Assistant, Trinidad and Tobago. I work on one of the financial scrutiny committees, so I think it will be interesting to take away some learnings that possibly could improve our process and how we do things. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Pernell Charles, and I am the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Jamaica. I am very pleased to be here. I have a special reason to thank the Canadian parliamentarians who are here. I have been invited on many occasions to come to Canada, but I think that it's a broader invitation for wider subjects and meeting more people. So I'm very pleased to be here, and just to advise you, Canadian parliamentarian, that I have accepted the invitation, so don't think because I'm here I won't be coming back. So thank you very much.
I'm Pedro Eastman, Clerk of Parliament of Barbados. I'm also the accounting officer of the body that runs Parliament, the Management Commission. I felt it was important to be here because we want to embark on a new system of budgeting and way of doing our estimates. So I'm hoping to draw on the experiences and the different methods in which my colleagues from around the ParlAmericas region utilize it in getting to that destination, basically. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Jenny Warso Di Cromo. I'm a member of Parliament and I'm come from Suriname.
Good afternoon. I'm Senator Down. I'm a whip and facilitator for the Senate Liberal Caucus in the Parliament of Canada. I'm here particularly interested in the more transparency we can have in the budget process.
Good afternoon. Dan Rumi. I'm a member of Parliament for Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge, British Columbia. Welcome to our province. I'm also the chair of the Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology, as well as the Vice President of Climate Change for ParlAmericas. And what I'm looking for here, I remember when I did we had our first budget, I actually did a town hall. And we had about 100 people come to our town hall, and we talked about the budget. We talked about what the possibilities were and what could we be doing, and that leads into the transparency part, because I found that when people understood what the process was, it actually was helpful to be able to move forward. So that's why I'm here. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Barton Scotland. I'm Speaker of the National Assembly of Guyana. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Janine Girodi McIntyre, and I'm the President of the Senate of St. Lucia.
Good afternoon. My name is Shirley Price. I'm the President of the Jamaica Household Workers Union and the Caribbean Domestic Workers Network, also executive member of the International Domestic Workers Federation. And I'm interested to know how this budget will influence women, and to look at the budget with a gender lens, and more so the marginalized, for example, domestic workers.
Good afternoon. My name is Juliet Cuthbert Flynn from Jamaica. I'm a member of Parliament, and the reason for me being here today is just to learn more. A lot of times my constituents who do not understand the budget and what goes into it, I think it's also important for transparency. I think that's needed in Jamaica at this time. A lot of time people don't trust politicians. They don't really understand how things work. And so when they want things to happen, they want it to happen now, not understanding that there is a budget and you have to work with that. So that's the reason why I'm here today.
Good afternoon. Akila Byron Nisbet. I am Senator and Deputy Speaker for the National Assembly of St. Kitts and Nevis. I'm also a member of the Public Accounts Committee, and so I do believe that this budgeting cycle will give some good advice and instructions into how we go forward with the management of even within our parliament, but also being a part of the Public Accounts Committee. It would be good to understand the cycle so that when you scrutinize, you are able to scrutinize from a point of understanding. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Torel Shriki-Soon, and I'm an independent senator of Parliament of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. My interest here this evening is one that is I have a very keen interest in this session, because as an independent senator, where we don't really represent a party's position or political party's decision, and our involvement in the budget presentation is only post the budget statement, then how is it that as an independent senator, you can objectively provide alternatives or even present ideals to a statement that has already been read, and also to analyze the difference between economic policies and social policies in the way in which a country is really supposed to be driven forward? What's the balance between economic versus people? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Suraj Rambuchan, and I'm a member of Parliament also in Trinidad and Tobago. I believe that this is a very, very important session, in that no nation can progress unless you have commitment of people. And in today's world, you're finding that politicians, ministers, governments are coming under increasing attack, even from their own supporters, because of the divorce that occurs after they win an election and what is done in the country on behalf of people. You're not going to get that commitment if groups or anyone feels marginalized in the process of how decisions are made, starting with budgets and allocations. Too often, budgets don't reflect the needs and aspirations of the citizens. And very often also, even when there is consultation between officials and groups in the society, the budget that is eventually presented sometimes doesn't reflect what those citizens have asked for, those needs and aspirations. I think that with budgets, you can in fact help to create greater inclusiveness if people are allowed to fully participate, but see the results of that participation. I am concerned with the universal dissonance and divisiveness that's going on, not only in my part of the world, but all parts of the world. And I believe that the world will be a better place if greater cohesiveness can be achieved. And we can start in one way, if the budgeting process is done for and on behalf of people. And in fact, that it is highly inclusive and participatory. Thank you.
I was for many years, 24 years, a member of the Barbados House of Assembly, and retired from that in 2003. But since May this year, I've been made President of the Senate, and I'm again in public life, as it were. I am hoping that I can learn a great deal from the specific topics that will be under discussion at this conference. But besides that, I'm hoping too that I can play a part in strengthening the relations between Barbados politicians and the Canadian politicians. And that goes back a long way. It is not widely known that Diefenbaker spent 4 to 6 weeks every winter in Barbados, and that he was a close personal friend of a long-standing Barbadian parliamentarian who ended his career as, in fact, he was both Speaker of the House of Assembly and President of the Senate, Sir Theodore Branca. It is not widely known to the passage of time erase memories that Pierre Trudeau was a close personal friend of Errol Barra. They were both students at the London School of Economics after the war in England. And he would often be seen a few times a year swimming in Barbados, enjoying good Barbadian food at well-known restaurants and so on. And that Barbados and Canada has had a long and close working relations. And the Barbados airport, of which we are so proud, was financed by the Canadian government about 15 years or more ago. so that I'm hoping, apart from learning and establishing relations, to strengthen the personal relationship so important in politics between your parliamentarians and the Barbados parliamentarians, myself included. Thank you.
Good afternoon, bonjour. My name is Stephanie Kuzi. I am Member of Parliament for Calgary-Midnapore. I am a member of the official opposition, the Conservative Party of Canada. And most recently, I have been named this past week the Shadow Minister for Democratic Institutions. So my apologies, Sheila. I'll be moving to Vice Chair of PROC for my Canadian counterparts. I would like to echo the comments of our colleague over here. My concerns in regards to the budgetary processes, which I have seen, and these go across party lines. The first one is that my understanding of a budget from an accounting perspective and within my own family is you take this much money in, you spend this amount of money, or you save this amount and then you spend this amount. And for me, learning that the budgetary process does not consider revenue in, expenditures out, was a very big lesson for me as a parliamentarian, almost to the point where I think budget processes should be called spending priorities for the fiscal year, blah, blah, blah. My second concern is over-consultation for the stalling of action. I think that this is something that has occurred significantly recently, where further consultation is called for in an effort to stall governmental decisions and outcomes. And my third concern would be selective consultation. I feel as though sometimes there is selective consultation with some groups which further the government of the day's agenda and ignore other groups. So my interest would be seeing the responses to these three concerns, and I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you. Merci.
Good afternoon. I'm Alvin Smith, the Bahamas' High Commissioner to Canada. I just came here last December after serving 20 years in Parliament, in both houses of Parliament, 15 in the lower house, 5 in the upper house. In my last 5 years in Parliament, I was the Speaker of our Parliament. I'm here because my government has directed me to always seek information, ideas, and practical ways of providing our people a more effective, accountable, transparent, and participatory governance. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here this afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. Alincia Williams-Grant. I am the Senator and President of the Senate, Antigua and Barbuda. As senators who are appointed, the absence of inclusivity rings very loudly to us. And it is, when it comes to the budget, that is. And particularly, we get a lot of criticism around budget time for just rubber stamping. And I'm sorry that funding didn't allow for more senators to be present for this session, but I will do my best to take back the information. It would be of particular interest for us to understand how we can engage in the process as appointees, and particularly those who are not holders of ministerial responsibility, and engage in the transparency of the whole process. That is a challenge for us. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Regan. Nice to see you. I'm the Speaker of the House of Commons of Canada, the lower house. And in that role, I'm required to be impartial, but I think I can say that Canadians generally and members of the House are anxious to see improvements whereby members are more and more involved in a thorough examination of expenditures and of plans of the government in relation to expenditures on an ongoing basis. There have been some changes in that regard in recent years, but it is an area, I think, of great concern to Canadians and to members, and it is one of the ways in which parliamentarians can exercise their responsibilities of democratic control over government. Great to be here.
My name is June DeWettering, and I work for Canada's federal parliament, and for more than 15 years I was the analyst who assisted the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance during the pre-budget consultation process, and I'll pass it over to the current chair of the committee.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Wayne Easter. I'm a member of Parliament from the riding of Malpeque on Prince Edward Island, which is considerable distance to the east on the other side of Canada. I chair the Finance Committee, and I'm also a co-chair of the Canada-US Interparliamentary Group, which is somewhat interesting at times these days. I look forward to the discussion because I'll explain basically what we do in our budgetary process in Canada on the parliamentary side. And look, there's always lots of improvement that can be made, so I look forward to the discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kate Ryan Lloyd. I'm the Deputy Clerk and Clerk of Committees from the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia. So as a resident of Victoria and an employee of the Legislative Assembly, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to Victoria, to British Columbia today, and extend on behalf of our Speaker, the Honourable Darryl Plecas, his warm wishes for your deliberations. I'm pleased to be participating later today as part of your panel discussion, and I'll be sharing with you the British Columbia experience in budget consultations, a process that I've been helping to support for about 15 years on my side. It's a process that just opened up last Friday with registrations now fully online, and the office staff are busy registering people in real time as we meet today. So I look forward to sharing more about the work that we're undertaking this fall and to hear from all of you later today. Thank you.
Sheila Malcolmson, Member of Parliament here on Vancouver Island. I introduced myself to you already, but I will add that especially when Senator Jaffer and MP Nault and I were talking about how great it was to host this in Victoria, partly it's because we have a really strong new government provincially in place, a new democratic government, and none of them could be here because this happens to be the week of the Union of BC Municipalities Convention. 1,500 municipal leaders and local government leaders from across the province. So it's just really unfortunate timing, which is why it's so great to have the clerk from the provincial legislature here to take some of those learnings back to that government. But I know if they were here, they would be welcoming you also, and glad that we're going to be learning together.
Alicia Todd, Director General of ParlAmericas, the International Secretariat.
Hi, I'm Amélie Lemieux. I'm the Program Manager for Open Parliament at ParlAmericas, and I helped put together this training session, and so I do hope you enjoy it, and I look forward to hearing from all of you.
Alors, encore un petit mot de bienvenue, et c'est vraiment un privilège d'être parmi vous avec des expériences diverses, ainsi que, je suis certaine, des leçons à partager parmi vos collègues aujourd'hui. So to continue, it is great having such a diverse set of experiences and people with us, and it is a real privilege to be able to learn from you today as we move forward in this. So I want to draw your attention to the Open Parliament portal. And the Open Parliament portal is a new tool that ParlAmericas has launched, and this tool really is for you. It is for parliamentarians, and it's a great space that, there we go, it's up there on the screen now. It's a great space that you can use for resources. It's also a tool for networking, and the tool will get better as you use it. So you can actually add and contribute content, contribute practices or lessons, or maybe even ask questions if you're struggling with something at home to share and to get the perspectives and feedback of your colleagues. And so on the site right now, on the portal right now, you'll find all of the materials from today's workshop, and you'll also have access to toolkits. And in each toolkit, you'll see a bit of an overview of the issue or of the theme. And then you'll have videos and you'll have practices that you can actually apply in your work. You'll also have, compendiums of, documents or experts that have contributed to the particular issue. And so it's a really useful place to be able to expand your network beyond your home countries, beyond your regions, but also to be able to dialogue more frequently with each other. It's always great to be in a room face to face, but when that's not possible, these types of portals can be really helpful. So Emily will actually be adding a lot of the notes and a lot of the conversations from today to the portal. And we do encourage you to use it because as was noted, it will get better as you contribute to it. And so before we go ahead, I'm curious to know what is your most fundamental role, and maybe we can have a few of you share them with us. What in your mind is your most fundamental role as a parliamentarian? I assure you this is not a trick question, it's actually more out of curiosity. Please, Mr. Easter.
Well, not on the, I think our most fundamental role as a parliamentarian in the ridings we represent is to represent our constituents and to work with, at least in our country, you work through your constituency office for a lot of cases on the ground that very personally affects people's lives. That may be employment insurance, Canada pension plan, pension issues, whatever. At the federal level, I think our responsibility mainly is to strive to have good governance, and whether you're in opposition or in government, I think it's important to, because as backbenchers, I know there's a lot, it drives me nuts when I hear people stand up and say, as part of the government. I'm not part of the government. I'm part of the governing party. The government is the cabinet. And I think as backbenchers, plus as opposition members, it's our responsibility to hold the government to account.
Thank you. I see nodding heads. Were there any other thoughts? Please.
I'm going to echo my colleague's point of view, but at the same time, for me, this is my first time in any kind of politics, and what I was doing before was almost like I had my own coffee shop, so I was a barista, and like a bartender, people tell the barista all sorts of stories, and the one thing that really struck was how people didn't understand the decisions that were made in Parliament, what the government was doing, the roles that government played. And a lot of it had to do with perhaps elected officials not being accessible. And when I got elected, that's one of the things that I said that I would do, is become more accessible to people. And we meet people in the office all the time. They come in, they're upset, they're angry because of something they saw on Facebook, something they heard on the news. And I see that as an opportunity to, okay, this is what you heard, here's what actually is going on, and here's the opportunity to try to help people understand the process of what goes on. If we don't do that, if we don't work and make ourselves accessible to our constituents, then there's a vacuum in place. And if all that's being fed is on social media. And I think we have an obligation to make sure that we communicate whatever the messages might be, but also to bring that back to Parliament. Wayne had mentioned about being a backbencher, and one of the things that I remember in the first year was kind of like throwing insults at the backbenchers. Oh, you guys are just backbenchers and you're nothing. I actually believe that as a backbencher, I have a great responsibility in being able to influence behind the scenes what goes on with cabinet, what goes on with my colleagues. But that's the power of being that backbencher, is you're taking in, you're bringing back information from your riding, and you're communicating that, and you're having great discussions with your colleagues, and that in turn can make the difference between the direction that we may go in. I think that's part of our responsibility.
Thank you for sharing that. Did we have one more? Because I think what we're hearing are quite consistent, right? That there's certainly an element of responsibility, certainly an element of representation, but being able to bridge the two is really tough. Because on the one hand, you're trying to educate, you're trying to inform, and on the other hand, you're probably mediating a lot of other interests that don't always align. And you're put in a bit of a tough predicament, right? You're trying to do the right thing, you're trying to get elected, and oftentimes you have a bit of an asymmetry of information as well. So I work for the former parliamentary budget officer, or the first parliamentary budget officer of Canada, Kevin Page. So in our parts, as one journalist put it, Kevin Page complains a great deal about fiscal transparency. And so with that said, we spend a lot of time in what we do thinking about these questions and thinking about how we can improve these practices. And one of the most fundamental roles, and probably one of the most important roles that parliamentarians have, especially those who are not part of the government, is to hold the government to account. And where that all starts off really is with the power of the purse. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the story. John I was spending like mad, really liked going to war, was taking money from a bunch of barons. The barons did not like that so much. They said, either you rein in your spending or we cut your head off. So he cut his losses, signed the Magna Carta, and then he had this council of advisors, which were effectively the barons, that would help him make his decisions and help him, or help hold him rather, to account. And that is really where Parliament comes from, and that power of the purse is why parliaments are so, so, so important. And we'll get into this a little bit later as we look at the financial cycle, but we can't stress how important your role is throughout the financial cycle. Your role does not just start and end with the budget. Your role is far more fundamental and really translates through and transfers through that entire cycle. So we're seated at the University of Ottawa, and at our institute we train a lot of federal public servants now, and we train a lot of financial officers. And these are people who know detail. These are expert accountants, economists, financial analysts who know their worlds inside and out. And the first thing we do is we say, okay, you have your obligations, but your work actually feeds a much broader process. Your work feeds parliamentarians, fiduciary obligations to their constituencies. You also help to feed and inform public debate. And it's really exceptional watching some of them make that connection that they've never had to confront before. And it's that connection that you actually have to confront every single day in your work. And that's a massive accountability, but also one that can be shared or informed by a number of perspectives. And so when we think about fiscal scrutiny and what you do as parliamentarians, fiscal scrutiny is tough. We actually we surveyed Canadian parliamentarians, and we asked them, and we said, what are your thoughts on fiscal scrutiny? Is it something easy for you to do? Is it difficult for you to do? What is it? And the vast majority said, it is tough. It's tough for a number of reasons. Because there are a lot of demands on my time, because I can't always get the information that I need, because sometimes I don't know how to read the reports properly. And these are all realities. And that asymmetry of information, especially in Westminster systems like ours, can make your jobs as parliamentarians difficult. But it's not insurmountable. It's sometimes just about recognizing where those asymmetries lie and where other ports or pieces of information may be available. And so when we think about fiscal scrutiny, we're actually thinking about three different things. We're thinking about the contextual, the context setting, right? What are the assumptions that a government is making, both economic and fiscal, to inform its plans? Governments don't operate in vacuums. They have a set of parameters that they're working with. So as parliamentarians, part of your job is to say, well, are these reasonable? Are we projecting or forecasting growth that far outstrips any reasonable assumption that any economist in the country is making? So the other piece really comes to planning. So what's the government saying or proposing it's going to do with its money? This is tough, right? Because this is all about trade-offs, and we heard that frequently today. It's tough explaining to a constituent that you can't have what you want right away, or we can't deliver what you would like right away, that there are trade-offs that have to happen, right? So what are the plans? How are you going to execute on these plans? That's another part of fiscal scrutiny. And then the last piece really is the performance evaluation element of things. And this might be the most difficult one because it's about results. And results don't always happen in the life cycle of a parliament. Results can't always be quantified. That's tough to do, but also part of your role. Because this is your opportunity to say, well, you proposed something, you promised something, you clearly asked us for the money, but what did we get for it? And so when we think about fiscal scrutiny from all of these lenses, fiscal scrutiny is actually about more than dollars and cents. It's about assumptions, it's about trade-offs, it's about politics, and probably most fundamentally, it's about people. And that's tough, because people are not perfectly rational, right? People are not, perfect interlocutors. There are a lot of interests at play, and that's what makes fiscal scrutiny so difficult, but also so interesting and such a unique opportunity in a parliamentary context. So if we consider for a second a typical financial cycle, there are roles for Parliament and there are roles for the executive. And sometimes in a Westminster system, it's conveniently somewhat clear. The government proposes, Parliament disposes or approves depending on the situation. So if we start with the pre-budget planning and consultations box there, right at the top, this is all about the government and its role. The government as overseer, rather not overseer, but as the unit, the entity, the state entity responsible for proposing and for making decisions. There are limitations to what they can do. They have to plan within certain economic assumptions. They have to plan with a set amount of money. They're also constrained by different rules. Jamaica, for instance, right, has fiscal rules in place to help it manage its debt. Well, those fiscal rules constrain how much money the government can spend. Other rules related to public sector wages, those rules, or those rates rather, in Jamaica are frozen, given the country's financial context. So all of these pieces of the puzzle come together then and there. So there are automatic constraints and also enabling elements that are put in place as the government is crafting, as the government is preparing how it's going to budget. Then you have the budget and appropriations piece. And this, to me, is where we lose probably the most opportunity, the budget and appropriations and audit and reporting. They're the busiest times of year. I'm sure Speaker Regan and all of our other speakers here, you can attest to how busy that season is, silly season, as I have heard it called before. This is when the government says, look, we've consulted, we have asked, this is what we are proposing. In our budget, here are new measures, taxes, new spending initiatives, directional changes to the way we're spending money. And here in our appropriations bills is everything else that we have to spend in the course of this fiscal year. Every single thing from public sector wages to pensions to, in the case of Ottawa, where I live, is the Rideau Canal that's been there for some 100+ years, and we are still paying for maintenance on that thing. It is a line item in the estimates, and it gets rolled over year after year after year after year. That's a lot of money that you're supposed to look at, and probably a very short period of time. So what do you do? How do you get through that volume of information? You have staff, you might have libraries, you might have other interlocutors that can support you, but at the end of the day, those pieces, those big blocks, those decisions have a lot of ramifications for the way you're going to do your job down the road, and also for your constituencies, for your citizens, for transparency, for accountability. So the way that information is presented matters. Is the information on time? Are you getting the budget proposal and your appropriations at the same time? Or, as was the case in Canada, are you getting your budget and the estimates, the appropriations at different times? I was sitting in a room probably a year ago in Washington, D.C. We were working on budgeting questions. I went in circles for 25 minutes with another delegate who was convinced I did not understand the Canadian system because they could not wrap their heads around the idea that it is possible for our budget and our appropriations to be presented at different times. We now, right, have a requirement for our appropriations bills to be presented or tabled before the end of our fiscal year, but that was not always the case. And so these are things that have real ramifications. These are things that have real impacts on the way you can work. We then have the budget enactment and the execution, right? That's the government's job. They have a whole public service. They have an entire executive branch of government. They need to get the job done. And then the fun begins when it comes time for the public accounts. You all likely have a supreme audit institution, an auditor general, or some type of office that will help you when the books are closed try to sort out what really happened, what results were generated. Was the money really spent, or were they having trouble getting it out the door? You know, were the right people impacted? Who was considered? Who wasn't considered? That's the financial cycle, right? And this is why Parliament matters. Because at those two junctures in particular, you have so much to do. And sometimes you can only focus on certain elements of it. Oftentimes what might be of concern to your constituents. Or oftentimes issues, right? Or policy areas that you yourself are committed to. And we'll get into this again during the discussion, but are there particular ways, or are there particular tactics, or tools or tips that anyone would like to share about how they undertake their own fiscal scrutiny?
Well, I'll speak to budget appropriations proposals and that sort of thing. You're right, budgets are very complicated, and there's a lot involved. Most people don't understand them. They might hear snippets throughout the media. So what I do is I always try to refer things back to my writing. And what I did, I went through the budget and I took out 10 items that I thought connected with my writing. And then I made 10 one-minute videos on each specific one, and we posted them on our social media. Because I use social media to be able to communicate those things. It takes away all the other noise, and you're focusing specifically on how that budget can relate to the folks in my writing. And I find that they were very well received. People were happy, they understood it. It takes a lot of the noise out. So for me, that made a lot of sense to be able to communicate to
That's really
my
interesting.
writing.
You're making it real before there's a crisis in spending that erupts. A neat practice. Were there any others? Or are you saving them all for the discussion later?
I'm going to sound totally partisan here, but I thought the Harper Deficit Reduction Action Plan was incredibly effective. He went to every department. He said, cut 10%. I don't care where you find it, cut 10%. I was the Deputy Consul General in Dallas, Texas at the time. I was a diplomat for 15 years prior to being elected in 2015. This was one of the hardest decisions I ever had to make. I had to let go of a trade commissioner. I had to let go of my IT person, having it centralized after that in Washington, D.C., but difficult decisions have to be made. So I would just offer this as an example of real and effective budgetary change, which can be a reality. Thank you.
Sometimes those decisions can be very difficult, especially for a government to make. So what I think we can get you through a conversation on the financial cycle, right, is the scope, the breadth of your role. Sometimes the different pieces that you have to put together. You're managing constituencies, you're managing party politics, you're managing a lot of dynamics as you're doing this. But this next slide here is what we call our fiscal ecosystem. And this is pretty standard for a Westminster-style parliament. And the reason why I love the concept of the ecosystem is because everything is interrelated, right? These entities of government don't exist in a vacuum. And they all, in some way, shape, or form, hold each other to account. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the executive branch. Fairly clearly, it's the government, the public service. Well, they influence Parliament because they're accountable for delivering information, both fiscal and otherwise, to Parliament. Parliament, however, is also responsible for holding the executive branch of government to account. And if you see yourself in the parliamentary structure there, you have a bunch of floating circles. These are your research staff. This is the Library of Parliament. This is your independent fiscal institution. Maybe it's a fiscal council. Maybe it's a parliamentary budget office. You have your committee structure. And you have your SAIs, your supreme audit institutions. So you have all of these component pieces to support your work. And they often come into play at different points in the financial cycle that we were talking about. And as you're working in your world, you have this whole other piece of the puzzle, right? Civil society, that to which you are accountable, to which you work, from whom you leverage information, you leverage perspective, you leverage expertise. And you know, somewhere in there is also the media, who's holding the government to account, who's holding you to account, who's trying to inform the public. And so you have all of these forces pushing and pulling, right, and struggling for power in what we call democracy generally. But there are absolutely limitations to the effectiveness of all of this. And when we look around the world, one of the pieces that comes up continuously is the importance of public participation in budgeting, the importance of public consultation in budgeting. Whether you're talking to the World Bank, whether you're talking to the IMF, whether you're talking to ParlAmericas, no matter who it is, because at the end of the day, they matter. They have to factor into the equation because you can't actually get anything done without them. But there are inherent limitations to that. When we think about consultations, when we think about, you know, different constituent groups or different components of civil society, you're sometimes hearing from organized interests. So sometimes it's easier for interest groups to reach a government. Sometimes it's easier for interest groups to reach a parliamentary committee. You also have the issue of trade-offs, I think that you put rather eloquently, right? That sometimes your own constituents don't understand that budgeting is inherently an exercise in trade-offs. Either you're going to pay down your debt or you're going to increase your deficit. You're going to increase your debt levels, rather, and then you're going to spend on X, Y, Z initiatives. Or maybe you had a crisis and now you can no longer reduce you know, your pensionable working age. Maybe you have to leave it at 65. You can't reduce it to 62 as you had planned or as you had promised. So these are the questions of trade-offs. And then the last issue really is the concept of requests. When you're doing these consultations, I'm going to guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, 9 times out of 10, no one is telling you, please, Mr. Easter, recommend to the government that they should increase my taxes, right? Or please recommend to the government that they cut spending in a particular program area. So again, that issue of the way these requests are coming in and the way these dialogues are happening is a challenge. And so how do you mediate all of that? Well, on the one hand, it's public education. That's tough, that takes time, but can be done. And on the other hand, it's having different ways of connecting with people. And that's really why you're here. You're here to talk about public participation and its role, I would argue, not only in budgeting, but in the financial cycle writ large. And how you do that matters. Because how you do it impacts who you reach, who you hear from. It impacts the conversations that you have, or sometimes the testimonies that you hear. And sometimes those consultations are not the only mechanism. There must be other ways out there. Because all of these, let's say, you know, parameters or constraining factors exist, there have to be other ways to get that information, to hear from those people. So parliamentarians, you have 2 levels of accountability. You have that level of accountability before you actually vote on the appropriation of monies, and you have the accountability ex ante after those books are closed. And there's a lot of stuff that happens in between. And so that idea of public participation is so important because it means that information is coming from other sources, that you have a secondary or sometimes a third data point with which to plan. Right? So there's a better planning environment. You have more information. You might arguably be able to improve your own decision making because maybe you're hearing from your constituents in a different way, or maybe you're hearing from marginalized groups in a different way. Or maybe if gender in budgeting, or if, you know, let's say in Canada, Indigenous or First Nations issues are of concern to you, well, now you have a different lens with which to see or to understand what it is that you're doing. And so an awareness also has to happen of those trade-offs because none of these things can happen simultaneously all of the time. And so informing that debate and contributing to that debate is really important. And one of the things that I hope that we'll get to during the panel's discussion today is the idea that there are a lot of practices out there, right? You have a lot of organizations like GIFT, the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency, that says, consultations should be timely, they should be accessible. You should hear from people in a number of different ways, whether it's submissions, whether it's social media testimonies, whether they're, posters, whatever it might be, however they like to communicate. Are you doing this in a sustainable way? Are you hearing from enough people? Absolutely. These are really important things to keep in mind. The International Budget Partnership has a survey that it does every 2 years, and Canada participated for the first time in 2017. And so in that survey, there are a number, upwards of 100, probably 200, upwards of 200 questions that go through the full financial cycle and try to assess how transparent, how accountable, how open processes are. And they actually talk about consultations and budgeting, but they don't talk about it exclusively from the perspective of the executive. They talk about it too from Parliament's perspective. Because if Parliament is supposed to be an overseer, Parliament has to have its own information. Parliament does not have a public service. Parliament is under-resourced relative to the executive branch, right? Parliament's roles and responsibilities are certainly different. But when it comes to finances, when it comes to the budget cycle, when it comes to those decisions, that is when your fundamental role kicks in. You want to be in the best possible position to hold the executive to account. And I do hope that in today's panel, we can get to this idea of no one actually wants to strengthen Parliament, especially if you're sitting in the government seat. That's tough. You're resourcing someone to hold you accountable. But at the end of the day, they will surely be on the other side at some point. And in an ideal situation, they would surely want an improved planning environment to enhance debate and hopefully to enhance decision-making as well. And so one of the things that we've developed at IFSD is actually a citizen budget tool. And this tool has a couple of different functions. We'll show you a few screenshots, and I do encourage you to take the opportunity to sort of play with the tool and take a look at the analytics that come out of it. What the citizen budget was designed to do, or is designed to do, is to help to break down spending. And the way we developed the tool was we took the major spending lines in a budget, right? Basic programs, healthcare, think about every ministry that exists, and within that ministry's portfolio, we broke them down into sub-programs. Every one of those sub-programs and every one of those broader programs or higher level program areas have spending associated to it. So if you're a citizen and you're interfacing, you can play with that spending. But in the top right-hand corner of the tool is a little box that shows your current debt level, your current deficit, and what happens as you play with spending. And so every time you hover over one of those programs, it tells you what the program does, it tells you who the program's for, who it impacts, but you're also reminded that you have these trade-offs to make. And so the way we've set up the tool is we've anonymized it. And so if you're a citizen and you're participating, the only thing you're asked for is your postal code, gender if you want to answer, levels of education in Canada, a mother tongue, basic indicators like that. Nothing that could actually tell anyone observing who you are or what you do or where you live. And so the power then for those in office becomes the aggregation of all of this information. Because if you're a parliamentarian and you're trying to understand what your constituency is thinking about, if you're a parliamentarian and you're trying to get your constituency to think more clearly about trade-offs, this is certainly one way you can do it. Because you can actually survey in a really broad way their thoughts on budgeting. You can also customize the tool, which is great. If you have specific questions or if there are specific issues of concern, whether it's to your constituency or to your party, you can include those in there as well. And one of the reasons we developed the tool in the way that we did was to make sure that it was mobile. So you can either sit at your desktop and play with numbers, as I'm sure all of you must love numbers, or you can just hold it in your hand. And for teaching, especially, we like the tool. But also, I can't stress enough, the power of the aggregated analytics. And so the opportunity to hear from a number of stakeholders who, say, for instance, can't necessarily present themselves to a committee hearing, or who might not be able to type a full testimony to make sure that their perspective is heard. This is one other way of doing it. And again, one of those other ways of getting to that issue of trade-offs that are inherent in budgeting, but also inherent when it comes to finances writ large. So with that, now that we've surveyed the financial cycle, I'd like us to take the opportunity, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, if we're still okay for time, to talk about a few things. One, we want to hear about your practices, right? So what practices have you engaged, or what practices would you like to engage in your parliaments to support this idea of public participation in budgeting? How would you do it? How are you doing it? And if we can, I'd like us to pay special attention, for instance, to the issue of gender budgeting that came up today. So are there practices or measures that you have in place that you're currently leveraging to be able to take these different perspectives into account, whether it is gender or whether it's marginalized populations? And then also, as we hear from our colleagues on these questions of participation, if you do have any feedback on the handouts that ParlAmericas has provided to you on the financial cycle and the fiscal ecosystem, we would be more than happy to receive it now as well. So I would invite you to turn to your neighbors, to turn to your colleagues, to have a quick chat, and then as we reconvene, we look forward to a really fulsome, a really rich discussion about what's happening in your home country, so we can take the opportunity to learn before we close things off with our panel.
multi-unit.
one. So we are going to reconvene. I trust you had some interesting conversations and hopefully some interesting ideas to share too. So as we anticipate, or as we plan to go ahead with our panel here, I did want to get your thoughts on all of these questions. So, how do you engage? How do your parliaments engage? What are some ideas or practices you wanted to share? And then if you had any pressing feedback on those handouts, you'd be more than welcome to share it now as well. So if we have the opportunity to hear from just a few people. Was that a hand, sir? No? No. They're at the coffee table, okay. So committee deliberations or committee consultations, I trust, was a typical one. So do a lot of people have, whether they're finance committees or appropriations committees, or those standard practices in other places other than Canada? Do we do that? We hear testimonies? No? Not really? Emily, do we have your authority? Then we will start the panel. Okay. So with that, I am sure that our panelists will have a great deal to say. So Mr. Easter, Ms. Olivier, and our Deputy Clerk, Ms. Ryan Lloyd, if you'd like to join us at the table, we'll get ourselves set up for the panel. Name tags and all for you. And the presentations are all in the same. Okay. So that will be yours. So with us today, we have the pleasure of hearing from Ms. Olivier, who is joining us as the Parliamentary Secretary of Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries from Trinidad and Tobago. A chemist by training, Ms. Olivier has vast experience in the energy sector, of course, in risk management and in resource development and in resource management, studied at the University of the West Indies, and has worked for various natural resource corporations in Trinidad and Tobago. Next to her we have our veteran MP, the Honourable Wayne Easter, who's been elected 8 times and who is currently our House Finance Committee Chair. Apart from being the current chair, he's served in a number of positions, both in government as a member of the opposition, and now as a member of the governing party, or as an MP of the governing party. So we look forward to your perspective there. As he mentioned, he's a longtime member of the U.S.-Canada Interparliamentary Group, and he's now the co-chair of that group. So needless to say, for Canada, this is certainly an important time to have as many of our parliamentarians and as many of our, members of government and members of the state apparatus working together on a number of important issues. And we also will hear from Ms. Ryan Lloyd, Kate Ryan Lloyd, who is the Deputy Clerk and Clerk of Committees of the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia. She has vast experience actually serving the legislative branch. She's done everything from working in the library to serving as committee clerk. She's also active in a lot of professional associations associated with Parliament. She's the executive director of the Canadian Council of Public Accounts, is on the editorial board of the Canadian Parliamentary Review, and has served as president of a number of other organizations and contributes research and writing to a lot of thinking surrounding parliamentary procedure and similar topics. So with that, we welcome our panelists, and we'll turn it over to you, Ms. Olivier, to begin our conversation today.
Yep. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all. And first, I must thank ParlAmericas for giving Trinidad and Tobago this opportunity to share with us on our experience and the steps we are taking to sort of increase citizen participation in our national budget cycle. I feel like the baby among the group with all the years of experience that I have as parliamentarians on the table. This is my first term in politics, having been elected in 2015. I certainly look forward to joining the ranks of the 12-year serving members that we have among us. Now, citizen participation in our national budget. Global standards recognize the legislator's role in budget approval and call for in-year parliamentary oversight of budget execution, as well as effective parliamentary audit procedures. Moreover, there is increased recognition that parliamentary involvement should be continuous, covering all stages of the budget process, including medium-term budgeting and priority setting. The role of parliaments in the national budget process. Parliaments the world over exist to ensure transparency and accountability in service delivery. Through their core functions of lawmaking and oversight, parliaments hold the government to account on behalf of the people, ensuring that government policies and actions are both efficient and commensurate with the needs of the public. It's a well-accepted democratic principle that no money can be spent without the prior approval of the legislator. So Parliament's role is therefore critical in checking excesses on the part of officials that have the mandate to disburse state resources. In fulfilling this role, the legislative branch performs a variety of functions throughout the financial cycle. Now, in Trinidad and Tobago, our fiscal year commences on the 1st of October, and our budget cycle begins in February to March, with the Minister of Finance issuing a request in the form of a call circular to all ministries and departments for the submission of their draft estimates of revenue and expenditure. In producing these estimates, the ministries and departments would engage in their own consultations with a relevant representative of the stakeholder groups to ensure that the needs of citizens are met. For major developmental projects, cabinet approval must be obtained before they can be included in the agency's estimates. And the deadline for submission of all draft estimates of revenue and expenditure is the 30th of April. So in preparing the estimates, many of the ministries, depending on the nature of the ministries, they would engage in consultation with their various stakeholder groups to determine what are the particular areas in which their constituencies would require particular expenditure. And during the ensuing period from May to mid-September, the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Planning and Development would examine, analyze, and hold discussions with the various ministries and departments to seek justification for the expenditure and make the adjustments as necessary. The role of the Ministry of Planning is critical here because the Ministry of Planning would have that oversight view for what the national priorities are. And together with the Ministry of Finance, then they would aid in prioritizing expenditure. Remember the comment made from one of my colleagues, one of our colleagues, who indicated that the national budget is really a list of priority spending, and in a lot of ways that's what it is, because there is limited resources and you have to decide what you're going to spend those resources on. Following the finalization of the document, well, then the Minister of Finance would seek Cabinet's approval of the finalized draft estimates of revenue and expenditure. And once approved, these documents, along with the appropriation bill, will be presented to Parliament for consideration and approval. One of the new measures my government undertook last year in 2017 was to hold a pre-budget, I can call it consultation, but it was really a presentation on the state of the economy. And we did this as a form of managing expectations, because there were some harsh measures that we intended to introduce last year, one of them being removal of a portion of the subsidy on fuel prices, so recognizing that this would lead to an increase in automobile fuel prices, so that the public wouldn't be surprised when it came. And we held a large consultation, which was televised and shown on social media, so everyone would understand the current state of the country's finances, being a largely oil and gas-based economy and with the lower gas prices that occurred prior to 2017. We needed the population to understand that many of the social programs that they had grown accustomed to would have to be cut, and we felt that this session and to explain the country's situation would have gone a long way in mitigating the negative fallout when the budget was read. Once the document is presented to Parliament on Budget Day, the Minister of Finance would present the appropriation bill along with the draft estimates and the other budget-related documents. These would include a public sector investment program document, social sector investment program, and a review of the economy. These documents would also be uploaded online to the Ministry of Finance webpage, and a limited number of print copies would also be made available to members of the public. And I think this is an important way of disseminating information to the citizenry. So at the close of the budget speech, the Minister of Finance would announce the date for the resumption of the debate, which would be no less than 3 clear days from the date that the budget is read. And this also provides time for full examination of the documents by members of the opposition as well as independent members. And when the debate resumes, it starts with a response from the leader of the opposition, who is given an equivalent speaking time to the Minister of Finance, so that there can be no appearance of favoritism in terms of presenting arguments. The debate would continue for no more than an additional 4 days. And following the debate, we have the commencement of the Standing Finance Committee. So at the laying of the budget, all the documents would be referred to the Standing Finance Committee, and following the 5-day debating period, Standing Finance Committee commences. Now, our Standing Finance Committee is a committee of the whole House. It is one important mechanism of ex-ante budgetary scrutiny, which is mandated under our standing orders of the House of Representatives. It considers the estimates and the appropriation bill, and it considers and reports on all proposals for expenditure of public revenues. So it isn't only invoked at the reading of the annual budget, but if there are any supplementary appropriations throughout the year, it also have to pass through a sitting of the Standing Finance Committee. This committee is a forum where an in-depth analysis of the budget is conducted. The committee has 5 clear days to examine the heads of revenue and expenditure. Originally, this committee was chaired by the Minister of Finance, and the meetings were held in camera, which made it less effective. And it was really a non-efficient form. The Minister of Finance would have read the budget, and if he chairs the Standing Finance Committee, it was basically just a rubber stamp. So we made some changes in 2014, where we changed the chair. So the chair of the committee is now the Speaker of the House. So we have an impartial person chairing the committee. And the order for examination of the heads of expenditure is now being determined by the opposition. And also we moved the meetings so that they are held in public. So now you have a genuine session where the opposition can determine which ministries and departments' expenditure is being examined, determine the order in which they're being examined, and they are allowed to ask questions on anything that appears in any of the documents. So prior to the beginning of the Standing Finance Committee, the leader of the opposition would notify the House of the order for examination of heads. The schedule would be made, and the House, the Parliament, would be responsible for ensuring that the relevant minister for the particular ministry is present, and the senior technocrats of that ministry are also present for those questions. And every question that is asked, if the minister is unable to respond at the time, the minister would then take an undertaking to respond in writing at a later date, and Parliament ensures that that undertaking is upheld. And these sittings are held, they are televised live, and they also appear on the Parliament's YouTube channel for persons who are not in front of television. And very often you may find persons from the public, well, they may contact a member of the opposition or another member and probably feed questions to them, which can then be asked within the Standing Finance Committee. So following the examination by the Standing Finance Committee, the bill is returned to the House, it's approved, and passed to the Senate for debate, where you go through the 5-day debate. Once the parliamentary approval is obtained, the appropriation bill is forwarded to the President of the Republic for assent, after which it becomes the Appropriation Act for the particular year. And it is now the responsibility of the executive branch to implement the measures, and the remaining responsibility of the legislator to continue to hold the executive branch accountable for its action or inaction. So our Parliament therefore has a role in monitoring the implementation of the budget, which it does through a number of joint select committees. In 2014, we established a Public Administration and Appropriations Committee. This committee is responsible for reporting to the House on the budget expenditure of government agencies as it occurs, as well as on the administration of these agencies. This is to ensure that funds are used for the approved purpose and to enable the detection of any challenges during implementation. It also allows for making recommendations at an early stage during the implementation cycle. Now, the work of the PAAC is therefore critical to Parliament's financial scrutiny process, but it happens during the implementation year. This committee is chaired by the Speaker, and it determines its own work program and focuses its inquiries on current issues relating to expenditure and administration. One of the tools that the PAC uses, again, it conducts public hearings, which are broadcast live, and viewers can also submit questions over the social media, which can be posed to the agency being examined. It gives real-time feedback to the public. So, in the event that there is a topical issue concerning expenditure being undertaken by a particular ministry, the PAAC can make a determination that this is a topic that we think the public would want further information on, and we can summon the accounting officer and the technocrats of that ministry. We typically do not summon the ministers in particular. We don't involve the politicians in this process, just the members, the public servants working in the ministry. And we'd ask direct questions related to their appropriation of funds or their lack of action in particular incidents. And some of our hearings have gotten great public interest, so depending on, so if there's a topic that the public, that is in the public domain that is getting a lot of attention, we may decide to conduct an inquiry, and we find that these particular ones, we tend to have lots of questions being submitted via the social media platforms, which the parliamentary staff would pass to the members during the examination. And we've gotten a lot of positive feedback from the public. In some hearings, the viewership with the parliament channel on that day tends to be quite high. For post-implementation oversight, we have the Public Accounts Committee, and we have an additional one called the Public Accounts Enterprises Committee, which does the same thing as the Public Accounts Committee, but looks specifically at state enterprises. These would be entities that are controlled by the government, but are not necessarily government ministries. So the role of these two committees, the PAC and the PAEC, is to ascertain whether monies appropriated were utilized in accordance with the purpose for which they were approved by Parliament. So whereas the public administration whereas the PAAC would have looked at implementation during the year, the PAC and the PAEC, these would review the audited financial statements. So these really look at what happened at the end of the fiscal term. So these committees in particular pay very close attention to the comments made by the Auditor General, which relate to financial management. Unlike the PAAC, which is chaired by the Speaker, the PAC and the PAEC are both chaired by members of the opposition, again with the intention of really striving to hold the executive to account. So there's no sense that the committees are really a rubber stamp, because the opposition leads these committees and they really do a detailed examination of the work of the ministries and the state enterprises to ensure that their financial management practices are in accordance with what is required of state entities. Our committees meet frequently. Most committees during the session would hold 2 meetings per month. Some may meet more frequently than that, and they would call in permanent secretaries, heads of government departments, accounting officers, and boards of an executive of state agencies. And they would seek explanations for any shortcomings that are highlighted in audit reports. These committees also conduct public hearings, which often gain a lot of viewership depending on the particular entity and any scandals that may be in the media at the time of the inquiry. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that parliamentary scrutiny is a critical function that aids in the fight against corruption. Our parliamentary committees, such as the Standing Finance Committee, the PAAC, the PAC, and the PAEC, are a vital component in the scrutiny of the executive. The effectiveness of these committees is dependent not only on the features of the committee in terms of their structure and the entities that are appointed to chair them, but also on the political, economic, social, and cultural context of the society in which they operate. Accountability is derived from the premise that those entrusted with delegated duties must be required to account for their actions throughout the budget cycle, and to some extent, you can have all the systems in place, but you are unable to mitigate what determined human beings would do on their own. But we believe that we have come some way in increasing transparency and citizen participation in the budget process through our financial security committees. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Olivier, for your presentation. I think some interesting pieces that came out were certainly the idea of your pre-budget consultations on the state of the economy, and almost the way it seems like you used that as an opportunity for public education and also buy-in. So I hope we can come back to that in the questions. And then also this idea that you sit as a committee of the whole. I mean, I'm sure that would be a very interesting, I think something similarly is done with appropriations in BC, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, that I think is just fascinating as an idea. So thank you very much for sharing that. And Mr. Easter, over to you.
All right, there we go. We have a number of slides that I'll go through. They will be on, I think, on the on your site following this. Some of them I'll just skip over, because what we wanted to do is basically outline the process that we follow through on the member side of Parliament. The budget process itself in Parliament, when the budget's tabled by the Minister, is similar to what Nicole has said happens in Trinidad and Tobago, except in our case we keep the Speaker a little further distance from some of those committees than obviously in Trinidad and Tobago. So what I'll talk about is basically the pre-budget process we follow in Canada, and it's designed to try and give as much public input as possible to the public, not only on the specifics of each finance line kind of thing, but some of the policies that may need to be removed, some of the policies that may need to be brought forward from the public's or the organization's perspective. So the first slide there, basically, there is a standing order of the House of Commons that authorizes the Standing Committee on Finance to consider and make reports on proposals regarding budgetary policy of the federal government. And this is different from all other committees in that the pre-budget consultations hearings are really mandated by legislation that a committee of Parliament, Finance Committee, must hold pre-budget consultations with the public and report to the House of Commons in December. Following that, just to come back to some of the things Nicole was talking about, the budget in Canada is usually tabled in March or April, so these thoughts are considered. The Minister of Finance also holds some private hearings on his own as well, but the budget is tabled in March or April, so this committee is to report in time so that the Minister of Finance has that feedback with recommendations for the budget that he or she will be pursuing. So really, in effect, there's a very intensive 3-month period starting as soon as Parliament resumes in March. Submissions come in over the summer. We set a deadline for submissions by mid-August. This year we've had 524, I think, submissions. Then we'll set up the hearing process. and it's fairly intensive 3 months' work for the Finance Committee in the fall. So turning to the next slide, just the makeup of committee, in case that's of interest to people. Finance Committee is members of the main political parties in the House of Commons. There's really 5 members from the Liberal Party, plus the chair, 3 from the Conservative Party, and 1 from the New Democratic Party right now. Those numbers change depending on the makeup of each parliament. So the committee is also supported, as it states in the slide, by 2 clerks, up to 5 analysts, logistics officers, and numerous interpreters and translators. We identify as a committee, we sit down government members and opposition members, and I think you will find that at least the current Finance Committee, and I think fairly historically, the Finance Committee has tried to be fairly nonpartisan, to try and just deal with the issues and as much as we can stay away from the partisan politics. We usually identify a theme in late May, and usually the theme is nationally important. It might be economic growth, it might be productivity, it might be competitiveness, but we'll try and identify a theme, and it's our hope that when we put out the release in June for the public to make submissions, they will stick relatively close to the theme. Of course, that very seldom really happens. But the intent is there. People have their own issues and they want to present them, and it's their right to do so, but we try and stick to a theme so that we can work out policy around this theme. So a news release goes out early in June, and if known, the locations and dates of public hearings, and we will hold hearings in Ottawa and throughout Canada in the last half of September and throughout the month of October. So this year, in the next 2 weeks, we'll be holding extensive hearings in Ottawa. And then we will be going 5 eastern cities in the first week of October and 4 western cities on the 3rd week of October. In fact, one of the hearings will be in Victoria here. Then from that, we prepare a report during the first 3 weeks of November. It, of course, has to be translated and distributed to members. We consider that as a full committee. We consider that report the last week of November, first week of December if required, examine the witness testimony, and we work together based on really motions at committee and make recommendations to the government, particularly the Minister of Finance, and then that committee is presented in the House the first week of December. The Library of Parliament analysts do a good job of really what they pull together. This year we've had 524 submissions that have come in. There will be the witnesses at committee. Most of them will have submitted a brief, and the analysts will go through each of those reports, draw out the key points for members, and we'll go from there. The next slides I will slip over fairly quickly, but why we wanted to put these in is to kind of explain to you. I think our process now is fairly good. It's had some ups and downs, had some setbacks. We did things wrong as well in the past, and probably will do some in the future as well. But this is the process that we followed to get to where we were today. Really started in 1994, and both Bob and I were members of that government, where the then finance minister wanted to involve the public more in the budget making process. It was mainly on tax issues, the new economy, and productivity. looking back on it as compared to what we do today, the Finance Committee at the time basically stuck to business issues. None of the more social issues that we will hear about at our committee hearings today. And that certainly limited to the, I think, the committee report to a fairly narrow focus. In 2002, it was kind of a more of a turning point. The then chair of the Finance Committee looked at the Senate results and what are the broad issues that maybe government should be looking at in its budget. The budget relates to really to all matters, whether it's your social policy, your economic policy, your pensions, whatever. So it broadened itself to more people, businesses, and communities, and tried and established a more inclusive model of getting information and witnesses and presentations to committee. It, of course, led to hundreds of requests to appear. In that year, I'm told, and I wasn't on the committee then, but all of which were accommodated, and I think the committee that year had some 800 witnesses, which is really, we had 300 last year, and if you asked me at the end of the day who was the first witness this morning, I couldn't tell you. But it's all on the record. And so it became a little overburdensome. So they tried new things between 2003 and 2010, deadline for witnesses for requests to appear, limit on the number of pages, and in fact today, of that 524, I think I've now got 325 read. We asked them, and most are following this procedure. First page is your recommendations, and then a brief of no more than 2,000 words, or we're going to send it back to you. And witnesses and organizations are sticking to that process pretty well. So we've tightened things up over time. On the next one, we'll skip that slide because I will say, if we're not already by it, June, the request for estimated federal fiscal cost of proposals. Look, we've had people suggest that. That is impossible for a citizen to do. I mean, it's just impossible. It's a good idea, but how do you make it work? So that kind of idea was turfed. Although some will come in and tell us exactly how much money they think we should be spending. Nothing wrong with that. In 2011, we've moved to, I guess, more openness. All briefs are available on the Finance Committee website, and not everybody certainly goes to the website, but it is interesting. One thing I really find that's interesting about the Finance Committee is there usually is a lot of new ideas out there, a lot of really, really good proposals. Government can't afford to do everything that's asked of them, that's for sure. I mean, you have to be fiscally responsible. But all briefs are available on the committee's website, and that's common for all the Finance Committee's study now. We try to pretty strictly limit the number of witnesses invited to make a presentation, and we try to balance that on our committee with government and opposition witnesses. We really try not to get into this proportionality too much. If they're a good witness, whether they're opposed to what the government's doing or whether they agree with what the government's doing, I think it's useful to hear them, and we try and balance that up. And as we say in this slide, we do try to have people focus on themes. The next slide we will skip. It basically just mentions that we try to have these briefs online so that people the public can view those briefs as well as they want, rather than just members. We'll skip the next slide as well in the interest of time. On This slide, the idea of a two-stream process is we have submissions, and not everybody who submits gets to be a witness and explain their point. And we also have some witnesses who haven't managed to present a submission for some reason or other, but that's the two streams that we try and follow to involve the public. In recent years, we've continued that two-stream approach. We identified themes, as I've mentioned. We do the broad cross-country hearings, and we've tended to, in the last budget year, and we will be this year again, doing a couple of visits to the U.S. to see what is happening there. In fact, this year we're looking at competitiveness. And one of the things we have to recognize in Canada, the tax changes in the United States could be impacting our competitiveness in Canada. So we're going to make 2 stops in the U.S. to look at what is happening, what's happening there. The next slide, we try and make sure that the witnesses represent a wide variety of groups across the country in the different regions, different demographic groups. There's a gender focus in that some of the briefs and witnesses highlight the priorities of women. And in fact, one of the mandates of this government is that a federal budget must undergo a gender-based analysis. And I think that's important. The 2017 highlights the processes occurred from 19th of September till early December. As I said, we had 300 witnesses. I might mention that the open mic sessions are, in case people don't know what they mean, there's the formal session, formal committee that's all recorded and witness and so on and so forth, typical parliamentary hearing. But there's always some who don't get on the list and they have a point to make. So we take a little time when we're on the road, for instance in Victoria here, where hopefully we can keep it down to a half an hour, where we give the public the opportunity to get up and make a 1-minute statement. Sometimes we'll stretch that to 2 if there's not many of them. But to make a 1-minute statement on an issue that's important to them. It is on the record. Members here, there's no questioning by committee members. It's just for them to put a statement on the record, whereas a regular witness, your members have the opportunity to raise questions to them. But the last 2 years at committee hearings, Engineers Without Borders, they had some young students at every city stop we made. Their whole point was to increase international development spending. And in fact, the Minister of Finance did increase that. It's timed over a number of years in this year's budget. Last year's budget our report had some 92 recommendations in it. I'll just go through 3 quick examples here. On individuals, their presentation highlighted areas health, security, and well-being, education, skills, and employment, and underrepresented groups, including seniors, indigenous people, women, and individuals with disabilities. On the business side, the highlights were taxation and regulatory requirements, trade and business supports, employment measures and contributions, and sector and business-specific proposals. And on the government side, and this came up earlier, economic and fiscal policy, how do you balance the books, environmental, scientific, and social policy, and infrastructure and transportation. So this year to date, as I said, our theme is ensuring Canada's competitiveness. A number of, we're in the process now of identifying witnesses, prioritizing who will have the opportunity to present, and we will also be making 2 stops, as I said, in the United States. What's worked over time, there has been a high number of briefs submitted. They're all across the board. So they do appear to be engaged. And I think the people, there's an expectation now that this has been done over basically 20 years. There's an expectation that we had, that if you're an organization, we had to have a submission in by mid-August and make our points to the government in that way. And I think that's a good thing. In a very, very broad range of issues and from regions and demographic sectors. Problems we've had in the past is too long of briefs, organizations, an organization that has many components basically presenting the same brief at several locations. We try and eliminate that now. And sometimes in the past, way too many requests for witnesses, but we boiled that down, I think, pretty good over the number of years. And I think the other important point is that anybody can make a can submit a submission, and it is on the website, available to committee and available to the public. Second last slide. I think on the lessons learned, it is important to identify themes that truly matter to people, businesses, and communities, so that people can engage around that topic. And as I said, they certainly don't always stick to the theme, but it's important to try and to bring focus to the committee hearings. And we try and select a theme that will allow individuals and organizations to identify with it. It's certainly important to hear from as many interested individuals and organizations as possible, be as inclusive as possible, and include the diversity of views expressed. Nothing wrong with people being in opposition to a point. I think that's how you get to a better point at the end of the day. And we'll leave it at that, Madam Chair, and questions later. I didn't, as I said in the beginning, I didn't touch on the parliamentary process itself. That's another process that certainly the Finances Committee is involved in, and we hold hearings on the budget when it's tabled. But this is how we try as parliamentarians with all parties to get as much public input from the public as we can in terms of what they believe should be included in the next budget.
Thank you very much, Mr. Easter. What I'm hoping we can come back to during the conversation as well is for those countries that don't have public participation models yet, what actually compelled action in Canada. I mean, I have my own suspicions given it was roughly 1994, but I'd be curious to know if there are lessons there for other jurisdictions. Thank you. And so now we have Mr. Ryan Lloyd from BC. I think so.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you to my colleagues here at the table for interesting and comparative examples. As you know, I'm the Deputy Clerk at the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia, and to begin, I wanted to thank the organizers for the opportunity to be here and to contribute towards these discussions today. As was mentioned earlier by Ms. Malcolmson, most of the members of the Legislative Assembly of BC this week are at an annual conference, a provincial municipal conference, and because of the nature of that important event each year, I know our chair of the Finance Committee, Bob Deeth, a member for Maple Ridge, wanted me to extend his greetings to all of you, and on his behalf and on behalf of the other members of the committee, it's my pleasure to be here today. In order to give you a bit of an overview of the work of the Finance Committee in British Columbia, I'll start by noting that it's a process that has been established here in the province now for 18 years. We undertook our first public budget consultation process in the year 2000. So my intent this afternoon is to give you an overview of its evolution over that period of time, highlight some of the key elements of the committee's process, identify some challenges and opportunities, and engage in a discussion with you all with regards to your own respective processes and interests in these areas. In British Columbia, an all-party committee, currently comprised of 9 members, undertakes budget consultation on an annual basis each fall. You may know that in May 2017, we had a general election in British Columbia, which produced very close election results. As a result, we have a minority government here in British Columbia at the present time. So the 9 members currently on the Finance Committee include 4 members of the governing BC NDP party, 4 of the official opposition, the BC Liberal Party, and 1 BC Green Party member, for a total of 9 members, for a relatively small committee compared to the numbers that we had in the past. Sometimes 10 or 12 members of our 87-member House would participate in the committee's work. Currently it is 9 members. This particular committee, like other standing committees, receives the terms of reference from the Legislative Assembly. So by way of a sessional motion, it is appointed each parliamentary session. But in addition, the statutory provisions of the Budget Transparency and Accountability Act outline the basic framework for its annual work on the budget consultation process. The Budget Transparency and Accountability Act, the statute that guides the committee's work, also includes some key provisions with respect to relatively tight timelines which come into play each fall. The Act advises that the committee must receive by or before September 15th a budget consultation paper which will guide the consultation work of the committee each year. That paper is published in English and typically translated into Korean, Punjabi, French, simplified, and traditional Chinese in order to reach a broad and diverse democratic population as possible in our province. If you have an interest in viewing the budget consultation paper, it's a usually fairly brief document. I do have some copies available here at the table. But once we have received on behalf of the committee a copy of the budget consultation paper, that is the marker that in fact opens up the committee's consultation period. It's characterized typically by 4 weeks of consultations with British Columbians, followed by 4 weeks of deliberations. So just as Mr. Easter was describing, a fairly tight and intensive timeline. Federally, of course, and they're covering the entire country. Here with our provincial focus, we also try to expedite things as much as we can to meet the statutory timelines of a 2-month in total process from the launch of the paper, the opening of registration, the receipt of submissions, and supporting committee deliberations. The budget consultation paper is, in essence, a government publication prepared by staff within the Ministry of Finance. It is typically released just before the September 15th deadline, and it is typically released in conjunction with the province's first quarterly update. So it will be presented in the context of a fiscal update, and it will also identify a number of fiscal themes and priorities for the coming year. The paper usually includes 4 to 6 questions that help shape the committee's dialogue with British Columbians. These particular questions also form the basis of an online survey that is hosted on the committee's website, outlining opportunities for British Columbians to submit specific responses to those questions in the paper. The committee will often receive hundreds, if not thousands, of submissions from every region of the province, and they work hard to ensure that the process is accessible by all communities. Large and small communities are particularly invited to be part of the process, as well as urban and rural ones. The budget consultation process provides a vital link between the work of the Legislative Assembly and the many diverse regions and populations of the province. Public participation has generally been successful, and there's a number of means by which the public can participate. To give a quick overview of our 4-week consultation process, this typically includes public hearings. This year, in 2018, beginning next Monday, the committee will begin its consultation tour of the province, visiting 14 communities. We've had different approaches each year. It's often shaped by the practicalities of the parliamentary calendar as well. The legislature will be in session on Monday, October the 1st, and the committee will not travel while the House is in session. So we have an expedited travel schedule beginning next Monday, September 17th. Just last Friday, September 7th, our online consultation portal opened up. And that provides an opportunity for British Columbians who want to pre-register to speak with the committee on a first-come, first-served basis. An opportunity is available to all individuals and organizations at the same time on a first-come, first-served basis on the online consultation portal. As of Friday morning, 425 individual time slots for presentations were made open, and to date, 222 are now full with individuals and organizations, and we have, of the 14 communities that have been identified for regional public hearing, we have 4 that are now completely full. It mirrors the same type of demand. Each year, it seems, those larger population centers fill up very, very quickly. So the public hearings in Vancouver, Surrey, and Mission, all in the Lower Mainland area, are now full, as well as the one in the Greater Victoria area being held this year at the Esquimalt Songhees Cultural Centre. But for those other communities that still have spots remaining and available to the public, we also provide an opportunity for Skype and teleconference connections. So in the event that we still have an open time slot while the committee is, for example, meeting perhaps in Kamloops or in Dawson Creek, members of the public will still be able to register for the opportunity, perhaps not to make a face-to-face presentation for the committee, but an opportunity to provide a verbal 10-minute presentation, including some opportunity for questions and discussion with committee members. We always emphasize as well that all means of communication, all means of submission and participation in the committee's work are given equal weight. So although there can be a heavy demand at times to have a face-to-face opportunity to present at a public hearing, the committee will also give equal consideration to input received in its other formats. So the next item of submissions that are typically received are those written submissions that can also be provided online through the committee's portal, as well as we receive many hundreds through email, regular mail, and the occasional fax still. The submissions, typically the written submissions are often more detailed in nature and are submitted on behalf of large provincial organizations or regional organizations. We typically receive between 300 and 400 of those each year. In addition, we have the online survey responses to the questions that had been laid out in the budget consultation paper. We usually receive the highest volume of submissions responses to the online survey. Our record number was 4,660 a number of years ago. Last year, I think it was more in the range of 700 responses. In addition, the final method of communicating with the committee include video and audio submissions. We try to make the process as open and accessible to all kinds of input. So although we only receive a small handful of video or audio submissions, they're often amongst the most creative. I recall a time when we had a music teacher concerned about arts funding play the piano and sing his submission to the committee. It may have been the most memorable one we received that year. While undertaking the public hearing travel, committee members will also carry out selected site visits to learn more about the communities in the province that they visit, including the industries and the natural resource sector jobs that support British Columbia's regional economies. In past years, the committee held site visits to an oil and gas refinery, a greenhouse, a fish hatchery. This year, they will be visiting a zinc and lead smelting facility, a logging operation, and observing an Indigenous language class on Haida Gwaii. With respect to the role of the executive branch, I've assembled a few comments to highlight the work of the executive branch and the legislative branch as it relates to the budget consultation process in particular. Of course, the budget consultation process is one that is carried out in essence by a parliamentary committee within the legislative branch, but the work of government is important in shaping the parameters of that. As I mentioned earlier, it's the statutory provisions of the Budget Transparency and Accountability Act which set the framework and the timelines for the process. One of the key challenges that the Act provides to government is the tight timelines. British Columbia is also unique in that it has a fixed budgetary date. So in addition to the fixed dates within the consultation process in the fall, we also have a statutory requirement that government present its annual budget by the no later than, or budget day rather, is the third Tuesday in February each year. So as a consequence, the officials in the Ministry of Finance do not have an abundance of time necessarily to sift through all of the submissions that are posted on the committee's website, to review committee transcripts, to try and get a sense of where the committee is headed. By November 15th, the committee's report is in the public domain, and so the government is able to take that into account in terms of their budget building. At times, in past years, before we had the capacity to load onto the committee's website the full text of written submissions and in a real time the transcripts and supporting documents for every committee discussion, I know the ministry was quite challenged and very much wanted to have advance access to that information. The committee at the time considered that carefully, but recognizing in fact that its obligation was, in essence, to provide advice to the legislature, held to its deliberative model. And although all submissions would be released at the end of the committee's process in conjunction with the report, there were no advance submissions provided to the Ministry of Finance. That being said, I understand there's still an interest in refining those challenging timelines to ensure that government can, in fact, make full and even better use, perhaps, of the input and the deliberations and the work of the committee. In 2015, an interesting article examined the work of the Budget Committee in a Journal of Legislative Studies article entitled "Improving the Relevance of Parliamentary Institutions, an Examination of the Legislative Pre-Budget Consultation Process in British Columbia." This is an article by University of Ottawa professor Dr. Genevieve Tellier, who concluded that this process had in fact become an important component of government's work to shape each year's provincial budget. The article noted there had been, in fact, a culture change within the Ministry of Finance in conjunction with the work undertaken by the committee. This was echoed once by a former Minister of Finance when he appeared before the committee, when asked by committee members about the impact of the committee's work and if it was true that the committee could have a real effect on the priorities of government. He said that the report of the Finance Committee every year is a very important part of ministry considerations. The staff go through it recommendation by recommendation and come back to the minister with advice on whether things are doable or not doable, what things might cost or not cost. They do that analysis and bring back all of the recommendations that the committee presented. The committee was buoyed by that because at times there has been a bit of a disconnect between the products of the work of the committee, the reports of the committee, and the budgets prepared and implemented by government. At times, in some administrations, there would actually be a summary within the budget documents released in February highlighting where there was a connection with the deliberations and recommendations put forward by the committee. In other years, it was less evident. There's often very much in parallel tandem a recognition of key themes that would emerge. Committee members often appreciate, after their hours and weeks spent on the road talking to British Columbians, the opportunity to see in the fullness of time within the budget documents an impact with regards to the committee's own work. So the work of the legislative committee is very much in their own hands. Once they've received the budget consultation paper, which opens up their process, they very much shape their own priorities with respect to consultations. I do have copies as well of the report from 2018, if anyone is interested in taking away a copy today. According to the deliberations of the committee, as well as the article I mentioned earlier by Dr. Tellier, it appears that the public very much appreciates the opportunity to provide input to this all-party committee. Ms. Tellier, in fact, interviewed a number of participants in the committee's process, and noted that the public believes that sending feedback to members at times can even yield a more comprehensive and accurate accounting of feedback that may have been sent in private to government at one time. The multi-party committee certainly allows for diversity of views to be deliberated and discussed and reflected upon in the report. The committee members within the report writing phase are often try to resist the temptation as well to bring ideas and topics to the table which may not have been present in the deliberations with the public. They try as much as possible and strive to have the committee's report reflect as closely as they can the priorities of the public. Although, of course, as elected officials, they too can deliberate and identify which themes to prioritize and how to highlight the conclusions that they collectively reach. I should also mention in British Columbia that committees' reports tend to be, although they're not always, but they tend to be unanimous reports. There is no provision in British Columbia for minority reports of a committee, so the conclusions of the committee tend to reflect those deliberations as agreed to by the committee as a whole. If there is no consensus, then the report will reflect the majority view, but the report in 2018, like many of its predecessors, was in fact a unanimously adopted report, which I think helps to sustain the understanding that, of course, a committee can be a less adversarial setting from time to time than we might see dynamics play out in a larger setting of the chamber. But there is also an appreciation, I think, around the committee table, perspectives from colleagues from different parties as well as different regions of the province, grappling with input from British Columbians and trying to assess and bring forward priorities, advice to the legislature that each member is comfortable and proud to support. So the committees have offered a forum for discussion, deliberation, and collaboration, and very much appreciated, I think, by participants in that process. Just with respect to my final slides, I'll just highlight that one of the key priorities that the new committee has set for itself this fall is to really encourage more citizen participation and to promote further engagement. We have tried to reach out this year through a variety of new communication tools to try and encourage first-time participants to the process, recognizing that many who came to the table in previous years had been perhaps participating for a number of years, perhaps their work for a particular organization who's keen to contribute, but the committee very much wanted to hear just as much from individuals in British Columbia and try to identify a number of groups, demographic groups, cultural groups at times, women, Indigenous groups who have not yet found their way to the committee's process to participate. So this year we've tried to develop a series of new communications tools to highlight different aspects of the province. We're trying to work more with graphics and try and promote a lot of the work of the committee in different social media forums. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the interaction with the public in terms of the administration and support of the committee is now supported through our online consultation portal, which allows an individual to register for a public hearing, submit a written submission, and answer the online survey questions all in one stop on their mobile device. So we're hoping it will be a process that there is some accessibility enhancements this year. We've also tried to send more communications materials out throughout the province, sharing information with local libraries, secondary school classes. The committee is holding a hearing on Indigenous, within the Indigenous community in Haida Gwaii in Masset, and very much appreciated the opportunity to be welcomed into the traditional territory of the Haida Nation, and looking forward to trying to create a more diverse and robust approach to British Columbia's many diverse populations and traditions. So online engagement will be continuing, I'm sure, to be a key theme of this year's process. We also wanted to try to maximize the investment of advertising dollars in this process. We always traditionally would advertise and continue to do so in print media, but more and more find value in boosting ads on Facebook, using the legislature's own social media accounts. It provides for us a way to measure through analytics on those sites exactly how many people are aware of the process, how many have actually clicked through to make a submission, and dollar to dollar provides us with a little bit more confidence that as the process moves online in terms of some of the engagement tools, that we're able to better understand how people have found out about the committee and give them more tools to participate. So with that, I'll just note that looking ahead, that the committee continues to have an interest in ensuring that it makes a real impact with respect to the shaping of the British Columbia budget. I know that although informally there are some interests around the table in things such as participatory budgeting, which is more common in a municipal budget environment. There's some very interesting innovations that are happening there locally. The committee welcomes as well the interest of the current government and the ministry. The Minister of Finance, who was before the transition of government, a longtime member serving on this committee, ways to strengthen the connection between the government's final budget as well as the work of the committee. I look forward to the discussion, and I thought I would close with this photograph of a distinguished delegation visiting British Columbia just a few months ago from the Parliament of Guyana, led of course by the Honourable Speaker Barton Scotland, who has joined us here today. I wanted to mention it because we actually have established a twinning relationship with the Parliament of Guyana, and we were very fortunate last fall on our budget consultation tour to have 3 staff from the Parliament of Guyana travel with the committee. I was unable at short notice to find a good picture of them hard at work on the road, Speaker Scotland, but I can assure you they were. And it was a real pleasure to learn from them about the work of your Parliament, and I look forward very much to hearing from all of you and learning today about the work in your jurisdictions on this topic. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for one more really interesting and engaging presentation. And I think the idea of how you foster participation in BC is such an interesting one, but also how you connect the process, right, to the executive branch side of things as well. I can imagine it mustn't be an easy feat, but something definitely that we hope to explore. So as we move forward in our session today, we'll propose a few questions here to our panelists to kick things off, and then I trust you must have some of your own questions. So we'll then open it up to the floor to hear from you, and so you can engage our panelists as well. So if I can kick us off here, I guess the top 3 questions on my mind are really, how do you compel public participation, or how do you compel consultations? So what would drive any allocation of resources to this activity? Sure, yes, of course. So consultations writ large, right? Not just with specific groups, but across the general population. How do you connect to the parliamentary and to the executive branch processes? So how do you actually get the information that you're collecting and help integrate or help to support the deliberations that are happening within Parliament, but also on the executive branch side that's ultimately accountable? And then, I guess I have more than 3, but it's okay, we'll start with 3. How do you manage your communication strategies? And by communication strategies, it's a few things. you know, on the one hand, it's managing expectations, but on the other, it's actually reaching a broad swath of the population. And so how do you do that effectively as you're preparing for these consultations? So I would invite Mr. Easter, if you'd like to kick us off on the consultation question.
On really on the first two questions, I think they're actually similar. I think you really can't compel people, but
if you'll allow me to interrupt, I meant compel Parliament.
Oh, compel Parliament.
Action in that area.
Well, I think what's been done federally, I mean, it is part of legislation that that Parliament has to do, has to hold the consultations. But I think at the end of the day, the public and those who went before the committee have to feel their presentation was meaningful. That the public and the witnesses have to be able to see concretely they've been heard. And that is either through, well, certainly the presentation is made public, but does it show up somewhere? And not everybody expects that, you know, they've made 10 recommendations, that 10 things are going to get through, but they want to see some essence of what they've presented has made it through the budgetary process in some way. And so it has to be meaningful. I think in terms of the federal aspect of consultations, you said, how do you manage communication strategies? I don't think the House of Commons does a very good job of that, to be honest with you. The Senate does a far better job in Canada of their communication strategies than we do in the House. But I think for our benefit, in terms of the Finance Committee, it has been an ongoing process over 20 years. And so all the major organizations and a lot of individual groups know the process is there, and they're expecting that process now. So we really don't have to communicate it, but we don't do a good job of communication from the House of Commons for committees in my part, in my view. And probably Bob would agree. Olivia?
Thank you. Well, in terms of pre-budget consultation, our Parliament has not been involved in getting feedback from the citizenry pre-budget. We are a progressive Parliament. I mean, we have been making changes to increase the transparency and public participation, and I'm certainly excited to hear about the methods that you would have used. For us to go along that route, it would really be I'm sure our current speaker is certainly be very interested in that, and I think the challenge might be to get our Minister of Finance to accept that the Parliament wants to produce a report, you know, to advise the government. So that would be a bit of a change in the way we have been doing things so far, but it certainly seems a progressive and welcome one that I'm sure would go a long way in gaining buy-in to the public, because the Parliament would be responsible and look at the actual economic state of the country at the time. So I do see that pre-budget consultation at national level being something that could be beneficial to our government going forward.
Before we invite Ms. Brian Lloyd in on this particular question, I wanted to go back to the consultations that you were doing on the economy. And did you find that that was an opportunity for education as you were engaging with citizens? Was that a way for you to help maybe set expectations, or how else were you able to use that forum?
Yes, so exactly. I mean, that was the intent of it, really, to prepare the population for what was to come, because we were expecting to increase the price of fuel and, you know, reduce some of the social programs that we have put in place. So in outlining, you know, so one of the focus of our government has been to really make the public aware of what the true financial status of the country was. We were concerned that the previous government wasn't leveling with us exactly how badly things were. So we have made a focus on, you know, letting the population know exactly the impact of the crash in oil prices and oil and gas prices and what that did to the economy. So it was important for us then, as a preparatory tool so the public would know what to expect with the coming of the budget. So that session, I mean, it was very well attended, it was televised live, and we've reached most of the population. So by the time the budget was read, I mean, with a significant increase in fuel prices, there wasn't any riot or any protest or anything like that. The population was prepared for the bad news that was to come, and it really did a good job in managing expectations.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. With respect to the question about how to encourage perhaps government interest in undertaking a process like that, I think the experience in British Columbia, which began in the year 2000, was a result of some interest by government into enhancing budget transparency and accountability. So it was one of a range of mechanisms that happened to be at the forefront at that one time. The provision for a budget consultation paper is also a good communications tool, in essence, for government. It helps to raise public awareness, I think, of the fiscal position of the province. It always includes some key statistics, which are, in essence, then made available and accessible to British Columbians with an interest in not just perhaps putting forward their own priority for budgetary funding, but recognizing as well that government is managing a range of obligations, you know, the size of the provincial surplus or deficit, if that were the case, capital spending, provincial debt overall. So these are terms that perhaps don't filter into every individual submission before the committee, but I think it's an excellent opportunity to raise public awareness about some of the challenges of governing. With respect to communications strategies, what we've tried to do with our committee is also recognize, in addition to making a large advertising investment, in fact our budget is relatively small, but we recognize the value of trying to encourage the committee members themselves, as well as all members of the legislature and their constituency office staff, to help promote the work of the committee. Most elected members, such as yourselves, will have extensive community contacts in various regions and sectors in the province, and so we always start our annual communication strategy by keeping all members of the House informed about the work of the committee, which communities they're planning to visit on a yearly basis, and trying to, through their constituency offices, distribute some of the communications materials that we will have developed. The online presence is wonderful to try and reach out to a younger demographic, but we recognize as well in a diverse province such as British Columbia, the geographic size of it, that traditional media is still important, including radio advertisements in some small rural communities. So we try to take a multifaceted approach to communications as we go forward.
Thank you, and I think that's such an important point that you raise about public participation generally, is that the political tools, or public participation as a political tool, when used properly, can be quite an effective one, whether you're a member of the opposition or the government, just because of that educative function, but also that sort of scene setting or baseline setting about trade-offs, whether they be, you know, fiscal, financial, or policy oriented. So very interesting comments in that regard. If I may, or first perhaps, are there questions from the floor before we go any further? Please.
And before I direct my question to Nicole from Trinidad and Tobago, I would want to agree with her saying that this whole budget process is a question of prioritization. You have to set your priorities right. But in order to get that, I agree with Kate that you need to go out into the fields, into the population, the communities, to find out exactly what it is that they expect. It might be easy for those who have a system of first past the poll with a constituency, but if you with a system of proportional representation where the whole population is involved, that becomes difficult, which is what exists here in Ghana, where we have both systems existing. However, I would agree with Kate that yes, you need to go there, talk to them to find out what it is that you will use as your priority, as Nicole did say. My question to Nicole is, in your Standing Finance Committee, which is chaired by the Minister of Finance, no, by the Speaker, how involved, that's the first question, how involved are the members of the opposition in that committee, if at all? And the next is the PAC and the PAEC, those, the chair of those is by the opposition. But are there questions or the trust of the questions limited to the report of the Auditor General, or it's open to any issue that the opposition might find they can gain leverage of? Those are my two questions.
Thank you very much for your questions. I just want us to be aware, just in the interest of time, I'm being told we have about 10 minutes left. So I'd like to take your question and then ask if there are any others from the floor. Please.
Bonjour. Bonjour à tous. Je vais essayer de m'exprimer en français.
Mais ça va, merci. Oui.
Et, pour votre expérience sur la consultation, sur la participation de la population, vous avez des données pour savoir combien de personnes participent dans les consultations budgétaires dans chaque pays, dans chaque réalité?
Dans chaque contexte.
Oui, chaque contexte, oui.
Oui, oui, non,
Voilà.
merci. Do we have other questions surrounding, yes, please.
Sure, thank you. I have 3 questions. I'm just going to make it very brief. The first is, if we compare Ms. Nicole's presentation to the other two, you recognize that Ms. Nicole's presentation was a little bit post-budget, whereas Ms. Cates and Mr. Easter's, it was pre-budget. So that my first question is it a legislative requirement in your jurisdictions to have pre-budget consultation? And if it is, what happens if it's not met? The second question is the role of the Parliament in ensuring that the budget consultation is held. Is it that Parliament is autonomous, or is it not? And is it dependent on government for its position in terms of proposing or advocating pre-budget consultation? And that's really linked to my third question, which was in slide 2 with Ms. Gaspard's presentation with the ecosystem. You had one icon or one box with the government and the second Parliament, where Parliament could have held the government or provide information or support through its audit staff and everything else. The question is Parliament autonomous in that model, or is it dependent on the government even for funding? Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have 3 questions here for our panelists, one on the roles and the reactions of committee members relative to witnesses, relative to participants, and relative to questioning. We have a question on how we, comment est-ce qu'on compte en effet le nombre de participants dans ces consultations, comment est-ce qu'on les suit. And then lastly, we have a set of questions related to requirements for pre-budget consultations and the role of Parliament generally in mediating and accepting those consultations and how Parliament fits within a state apparatus. If I may, Ms. Olivier, if you'd like to begin our responses.
Yes, thank you very much. In response to the question on the role of the opposition in the Standing Finance Committee, the Standing Finance Committee is really the opposition show. The government members are there to respond to questions, but the order of examination of the heads and the call to questioning generally comes from members of the opposition. So it's their opportunity to really scrutinize what has been put forward in the estimates and the expenditure from the previous year. In terms of our Public Accounts Committee and our Public Accounts Enterprising Committee, again, these committees are chaired by members of the opposition. There's an equal number there's equal participation on both sides. However, the questions that would be brought forward during a hearing would be related to the reports before the committee, but members around the table can also ask other questions. Once an entity is in front of them, I mean, they would be allowed to ask other questions as well. So there is really no limitation on opposition involvement in any of these financial security committees. Thank you.
Just to quickly run through the questions, I might coming back to your point on having to go out into the field, into the country, that's a very valid point. It's one of the reasons why we hold hearings across the country. The hearings are very different in Ottawa, in the central, in the capital, than they are in the other areas. And in fact, I guess it was the year before last, we had some national organizations that we didn't have space for in Ottawa, so we moved them to Fredericton, New Brunswick. And the leadership of the national organization told me after, it was a learning session for them. Even though a component of their organization, a local part of their national organization, made a presentation, they had a very different view after sitting in the hearing in the country than they did at a hearing in Ottawa. So that's extremely important that committees get out. We have similar here in Canada. An opposition member chairs our Public Accounts Committee in the House of Commons. I do think we get a very good cross-section of Canadian society in our process. You've all the major organizations, whether it's the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, both the large cities and the rural component, the labor organizations, the business groups, most of them will tend to be at the Ottawa side of the hearings, so we get a fairly good cross-section there. In Canada, as I said in the presentation, it is legislated that there has to be pre-budget consultations. It's in legislation in the statutes of Canada, and it certainly depends on Parliament for public funding. We have a certain amount of funding for parliamentary committees, and we have to make a presentation to that committee to get the funding. So it depends on Parliament to get the funding for the committee to do its work.
Thank you. The last word is yours.
Thank you. Yes, and to concur, much of what Mr. Easter described is true in British Columbia as well. There's a statutory requirement that the committee undertake its work. We have no experience with a committee not being tasked with that annual process each year. I know that there has been a recent change to the set election date in British Columbia for general elections, with an eye to moving it from the spring schedule to a fall schedule. So the next provincial general election is expected in the month of October. When it was pointed out by somebody that would interrupt, of course, the annual budget consultation process, it was remarked that, of course, the general election is the greatest budget consultation process of all. So that year, we will presumably have a pass on this annual process. In terms of numbers, we've had variable levels of participation each year, peaking out, I think, in the mid-2000s at around 6,000 participants in a single year. That particular year also coincided with a very expensive advertising campaign that government chose to initiate to support the budget consultation work of the committee. So it was not in the committee's hands per se, but the committee's process was widely publicized that year and resulted in high numbers. I'll also mention just the federal member, I apologize, I forgot your name, but you had mentioned the notion of special interest groups, and I just wanted to flag that because with online consultations, there's always a real possibility. We've had instances in the past where an advocacy group might try and, for example, fill out one of the online questionnaires and then send it to thousands of their members with suggested responses and do a sort of an automatic send back to the committee. So we're always very careful to monitor the source of all online input and ensure that they're coming from different IP addresses, and that if we do in fact receive, as we have, thousands of identical responses from a single group, that we can flag that information for the benefit of members. At the end of the day, of course, the value to the process is that it is a deliberative process, so it's not necessarily a numbers game in every case. The members will take that into account when assessing the input received, and although they will report it out as a key theme that they heard, it may or may not necessarily profile that way in the priorities that they determine as a group.
Thank you. One last question.
I understand there is a law that demands pre-budget consultation. Is there any law that binds the government to any percentage of the Finance Committee submissions? Or that binds the government to any of the submissions from the public that will be forwarded to the government?
That's an excellent question. How do you track results, right? How do you see where your submissions go and what happens to them?
No, but I would come back to what I said earlier, and that is the public has to see that the consultations have been meaningful, or I think they will pay a price. Certainly, and opposition parties have a role to play as well. I've always maintained you don't have good government unless you have good opposition. And so if you held hearings and never listened to one thing as a government that was said in those hearings, I think you'd be in trouble. So they have to be, and the government has to understand that that the hearings have to be seen, have to be meaningful and be seen to be meaningful, or your participation will dry up, and I think it'll cost the government its authority eventually down the road.
Thank you.
We're only there at the will of the people.
You are a very seasoned politician. No, thank you very much for our panelists. You always know it's a good panel when you sort of run out of time and there are still more questions and more conversation to be had. So I thank you very much for such an engaging discussion, and one that I hope does continue. A few key takeaways from today, if we sort of summarize it, if you will, in 3 points, is really the role that parliaments and parliamentarians have in making that connection between money, between democracy, between your role inside of Parliament and the role of the public. And we talked a great deal about how you might do this well, and that your role extends far beyond a single point in the financial cycle, but really does extend, through the entire financial cycle, and really happens before the money is appropriated and after the money is appropriated at those two levels of scrutiny and accountability. And that your role does matter, and that there are real repercussions, for you from your role, and also your ability to effectively fulfill your duties and your obligations. And that if we can improve debate and improve education, and also hopefully improve the nature of decision making with the diversity of perspectives, from multiple constituent groups in government and from the public, that those multiple perspectives should hopefully help to inform better decision making over the longer term. And so with that, again, I thank our panelists. We thank all of you for being here. And again, our thanks to ParlAmericas and to Emily in particular, who has done such a nice job in organizing all of this today. And so we leave the final word of today's session to Ms. Malcolmson.
Thank you so much to all the panelists and to our able facilitator. This is when I reinforce that we need everybody's feedback forms filled in, right? Okay, that is going to happen. Please, it is very important to the organizing committee that we know that the sessions are meaningful to you and helpful, so please do help us by letting us know your input. Now, on a happier note, less kind of homework like, that's not, you're right, that's not an unhappy note. But less like homework, more like fun, I have the great honor of reiterating the invitation to the entire ParlAmericas delegation, the invitation from the Honourable George Fury, who's Speaker of the Senate of Canada, and the Honourable Jeff Reagan, Speaker of the House of Commons of Canada. They're inviting you tonight to a welcome reception at the Royal BC Museum. It's a beautiful museum full of Indigenous art and pioneer history. It's such a point of pride for us, and it is right across the street. It could not be closer. So it's a 5-minute walk, and we encourage you to leave. We're starting at 6:45? We will gather at 6:30 in the Palm Court. which is just outside. And if you're not sure how to get there, ask one of the dozens of helpful people who are here to be the border collies to herd us where we're supposed to be. If you want to take a bus, you can do that. Although I will say again, it is a 5-minute walk. But meet outside here in the Palm Court at 6:30 and we can either walk over together or bus together, and we look forward to seeing you and taking the invitation of our honorable speakers at the Royal BC Museum tonight. Thanks everybody for their attention and participation.